The sequence that we'll be using today is that I will be, well, we have a little YouTube, of course, and then I'll be talking a bit about the history of ebooks. And Beth will be summarizing some research about student learning in ebooks. Then we'll have the panel, and we'll have a few words of conclusion, and we'll be having the questions and comments at the end. So as you think of things, maybe just jot a note, or if you have a good memory like I don't, you could just remember what they are. This is a little film to remind us that changing to new formats isn't new.
Inni her så ligger det kanskje flere hundre sider med lagret tekst. For å komme videre så tar vi tak i et ark så drar du over neste side og da fortsetter teksten her. Du blar altså. Du blar. Da blar du tilbake. Så tilbake til den teksten. Ok, så den slutter der, og så fortsetter du der. Hva jeg skal avslutte med da? Slår du sammen permene på den måten der. Sånn. Når du lukker til, ligger alt lagret inni der. Jeg risikerer ikke å miste nå teksten her. Ja, det tilfellet som fyr. Når du holder på med skriftruller, så tar det litt tid å markere til å bla i en bøk. Ja. Ja, men det er det før det går. En gang til. Så jeg åpner sånn, og så har du katter den. Jeg blar frem og tilbake. Og når jeg er ferdig, så bare lukker jeg den. Flott, fint det. Kjempefint. Ja, men du, nei, ikke sant? Ja vel. Har du ikke det? Manualen, vi skal følge en sånn manual som bruker verden ditt. Ja, den. Ja, men ikke sant, det er noe samme problemet.
So a little bit about the history of ebooks. And don't get too concerned. I'm going to be spending most of the time on the first point because I think it's an interesting story. On July 4th, 1971, Michael Hart, a freshman at the University of Illinois, got his first account from the university. Prior to heading over to the computer center where he could access the Xerox Sigma 5 mainframe, he stopped to get some groceries. As he was checking out, the clerk put a replica copy of the Declaration of Independence in his bag. So after he got over to the computer center and logged in for the first time, he had a visionary idea that text files of public domain works that out of copyright in ASCII format, and some of you younger people might not even know what that is, could be freely and widely made available. He immediately hand-keyed in what he had at hand, the Declaration of Independence. Then he posted a notice announcing that the document was available for downloading by anyone who had access to that network, and that was about 100 people. This same network eventually became part of the internet. Hart named his fledgling initiative Project Gutenberg, and some of you may have heard of that, named after the inventor of the printing press. He solicited some volunteers, and he himself devoted his life to inputting texts. And it took many years for the King James Bible to be input by hand. It was finished in 1989, and each book of the Bible had to be created as one file. And then also another long one that they did was the complete works of Shakespeare, and then also many smaller books. Currently, Project Gutenberg has over 38,000 books available. In 2008, there were over 3 million downloads in 1 month. Michael Hart was a very eccentric and vocal man, from what I've been reading about him. And as I said, he spent his life working on Project Gutenberg. It was very important to him that everything be free. He made no money from it at all, and in fact, he lived as a very poor man by choice. He died at the age of 64 just this last September. And then, as I have here, in 1993, the National Academy Press was the first to post some of their ebooks, for some of their books in ebook format for free, as long as they had the author's consent. And they were surprised that their sales actually increased, their sales of print books. 1995, Amazon began and offered excerpts from books. 2001, Wikipedia came about, and the first online cooperative encyclopedia, and major publishers began to look at the ebook model. 2006, you've all heard of Google Books. They began their very large project of providing full text of public domain books and excerpts of copyrighted books from university collections. In 1996, reading ebooks began to be done on electronic devices. The first was on PDAs, and I remember seeing this, people reading from there. It was kind of small, and the screen wasn't very well lit, but they did do that. And then that was followed by a number of other ebook readers, but none of them were really widely used until in 2007 when the Kindle was introduced. And we all know what happened after that.
So I'm going to spend a few moments just talking about what does the research say about the use of ebooks in academic research. I think this is kind of what started my interest, was reading through some of this research. So I was really excited today to be able to co-facilitate this and kind of talk a little bit about the greater world, what does some of the research say, and also discuss what's happening here on campus. One surprise that I found when I was doing this research was how little research there's been, given the hype of ebooks. When I looked at, is there been research about the cognitive and learning implications of using research for academic study? And there really wasn't as much out there as I had expected to find. So I'll be highlighting 4 studies that I came across and I thought had interesting results. Overall, though, there seems to be a pretty bright divide between using ebooks for leisure or linear reading, starting on page 1 and just reading through the book, and using ebooks for academic or non-linear reading, where you need to flip back and forth a lot and use multiple resources at once. And the other main thing that I saw was in several studies, students still preferred print to ebooks for academic use. About 75% of the students still had that preference. So that I found in several different studies. So I'm going to be reviewing a few pilot studies and then some studies that did actual comparisons of print to ebooks. This first pilot study here was kind of a summary of some pilot studies on 3 different campuses, sort of what we've done here on this campus with the iPad pilots. And the students were given ebook readers for their academic use throughout a term. And what they liked, I think, was not too surprising. They liked the portability, the storage of multiple books on one, very small, easy to carry around device. The costs, they liked the link out to dictionary and glossaries, those sorts of reference items, and then links to external resources and the multimedia features that are available. However, what the students did not like was a lot of the academic uses that you would want them to be doing with the ebook and the ebook reader. They did not like the features that the ebook had related to the highlighting or annotating, skimming through the text quickly, or flipping back and forth through the book as they would need to do. And then, of course, using multiple resources at once. So they found that to be very difficult and challenging. And then another pilot study, this one from University of Washington, I found this statistic pretty interesting. All the students in the study were given e-readers, but by the end of the term, less than 40% of the students were still using e-readers, at least for academic use. So the drop-off was pretty steep in this particular study. And the other reason I wanted to highlight this pilot study was they really talked about this term cognitive mapping, where the students complained that they couldn't really use the physical or tangible cues of the book itself to help them in the learning process. And I think as we all are used to reading physical books, we kind of have mapped in our mind where it is in the text or in the book, and that kind of helps us to remember it. And a lot of times they complained about feeling lost in the book. They didn't know where they were. So I think that certainly has learning and cognitive implications that need to be addressed by the ebook developers. And then I want to highlight 2 research studies that I found that directly compared ebooks to print books. And this first study was out of Abilene Christian University. I believe that they did a rather widespread iPad pilot project, if I recall correctly. And in this study, they had students read a passage either on an iPad reader or in print. And it was interesting, I think, because it was just a linear passage. They just started at the beginning of the passage and read through. And then they were quizzed on comprehension and learning transfer or application of that knowledge. The results found comparable results for comprehension. There weren't any significant differences in comprehension, but they did actually find significantly better results for the learning transfer portion of this from the e-text as opposed to the print book. So that research, it went into some explanation as to why that might have been, but I did find that interesting. And certainly, again, some learning implications if that finding could be reproduced. And then I think this was the study that kind of really piqued my interest in this discussion. The students were instructed to find identical pieces of information in either a print book or an identical ebook. So you're, instead of reading through a passage, this was more of the academic research of going and finding a particular piece of information. And what they found in print, which I think is of no surprise to anyone, students used a very predictable and linear way of finding that information. They had the print book, and then they either looked at the table of contents or the index, found a relevant keyword, went to that page, and then scanned the page and found that piece of information, kind of what we're all used to doing with the print book. But what I found fascinating was in the ebook, the students in the study didn't really seem to transfer that knowledge of how to use a print book and apply it to how to use an ebook or modify it in any way. So the processes that they used to find the identical piece of information in the identical book was very non-predictable and non-linear. They were unaware and expressed surprise when about the presence of a table of contents or an index. And then when they went to just do a search of the book, which is probably what I would expect them to do, the searches themselves were rather poor quality. So they didn't come up with the pages of the book that might have that relevant piece of information. So then after that search, I liked how the article put it, where their next step then was to simply haphazardly and randomly flip through the book, kind of hoping for some serendipitous discovery. So it was not an efficient searching process to go in and find a specific piece of information. When scanning, the researchers noted that the students missed seeing relevant information more often in the ebook than in print. And again, going back to this cognitive mapping, students complained that they had no sense of place. They said that they felt lost in the book again. So going back to some of the physical cues. So those were some of, I think, some of the benefits and positives, as well as some of the challenges that I found in some of the larger research. So I think we'll move on to the faculty panel now.
Glad to see our last panelist arrived. You want to join us up here at the
Our class before I gave an exam today, we had some folks that needed extra time.
All right, I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. First one is Valerie Smith. She's professor of theater, and Jean Murbaugh, professor of computer science. Both of them are going to be talking about, they got an innovative technology grant, or I guess iPads, or different readers, they can explain it to you, that they were involved with this year. And then David Pettigrew, assistant professor of history, is going to talk about his use of ebooks in archaeological field research, and there was something else that you emailed me about they're going to talk about too, so you can tell them what that is, because I forget. Mike Cosby, distinguished professor of New Testament and Greek, and he's going to talk about using an e-reader when he was on sabbatical in the fall semester. And then John Villa, associate professor of history and department chair, will be talking about his students' use of the e-versions of 200-year-old texts. And I'll just throw in that hot from the news is that John's book, was America, I'm trying to read my writing here, was America founded as a Christian nation, is that correct? He's been announced as one of the 3 finalists for the George Washington Book Prize, which actually, if he wins, he'll be a little bit wealthier. Congratulations. And we won't even talk about the little Beck episode that he's involved with. Glenn Beck, that is. Okay. All right. Thanks. Or do you need to turn on that camera?
those are some of the problems that we have with technology, so right there. I came to this kind of resistant when I was doing my research for my dissertation on a troupe of musical theater performers from London. I needed to go to the British Library and look up the Lord Chamberlain's book of excisions from all of the musicals and plays of that particular year to see what was cut out because of content and controversy and language. And, you know, get those books brought to me after hunting for the correct numbers and looking at what in 1866 the Lord Chamberlain's clerk actually wrote in to cut out of the script, and touching those pages even with white gloves was just this wonderful romantic experience for me. So when I discovered years later that that trip is no longer necessary, that some of those excisions can be discovered online, digitally, there was a part of me that was really sad to hear that. Clearly much less expensive. Now my students can see it because I can just, you know, bring it up online. But now that I'm into it, I'm pretty much a convert. I wrote a grant this past year, and all of our faculty have iPads, and then we decided as a department that we would require our students to have a laptop, which 99% of our students have a laptop. So this isn't so egregious, but we asked that everyone have a laptop or a reader, iPad if they choose, or a smartphone that they would then bring to every classroom, and we would begin to figure out ways to connect, and we have had lots of successes and lots of failures with doing this. So I'll talk about a couple of classes. The first one is a theater history course, and this is the textbook, and they've complained to me for years about how heavy it is and how it's, you know, changing their spinal alignment because they have to carry it around in their backpack. And so when half of them decided to get this as an ebook, they were pretty excited about that. Some of those who have it on the ebook have fallen in love with it. They think it's great, and I'll go through a number of the reasons why. And others who chose to go the ebook direction have missed this book. It's a 2-semester course, and they didn't have it last semester, they have it now. They miss just the tactile, sensory feeling of a book and being able to curl up with a book, which to me, you can curl up just as easy with this. But there's something in their own sort of understanding of what it means to read a book and to absorb it that feels different than this. And I think a lot of it's the light. Even if I tell them they can change the lighting and make it sepia toned, they're still just kind of resistant to it. And again, others really enjoy it. So with this particular book, what you can do in the ebook version that you cannot do with the actual textbook is just to be able to flip through all of the connections that are made here. So, for example, if we are studying Samuel Beckett, there will be a link in the page itself to go to Beckett online resources, and from there you can go to hundreds of other places, including YouTube clips of interviews with Beckett, recent production at the National Theater, Texts for Nothing, which was turned into a play at the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, and the list goes on. It's a terrific resource. If you are reading your book on the beach, you're not going to be able to do that. So again, real pros and cons. In terms of how this book is constructed, every chapter has YouTube links, movies, downloads, articles that you can immediately access. Another thing that has been very useful to me is the use of iBooks and being able to go to Project Gutenberg and other places and take a look at public domain texts such as no theater, plays. Let's see. I think I have that up here. But I can, instead of bringing a number of different scenes to the classroom with me, they can all go to a link and we can read just a few scenes from a No or Kabuki play that they wouldn't have been familiar with before and give them a more in-depth understanding of the particular theater form we're looking at. So those are some of the things that have worked really well with the theater history class. In a more applied course, such as Voice and the Actor, there have also been pros and cons. About half the class, again, has chosen to have the textbook in hand, and others to have it as an ebook. and they were both required to have them in class either way. But one of our textbook authors is Patsy Rodenberg, and so many times we've gone to her explaining a particular chapter in a book called The Second Circle about vocal production, and again, without having to go get in my bag and get a number of other materials and pop in a DVD, I can just, flip over and here she is, ready to teach a class. So that's the author of our textbook, talking about one of the chapters that we use.
It's very controlling. We sometimes need third circle energy. We sometimes need first circle.
Okay, in addition to Patsy, I have a chance to go to iTunes University very easily and have the National Theater directing and, whoops, that's my son.
That never happens.
Yeah, right, okay, I'll admit it, half the apps are probably his. Okay. But the National Theater through iTunes University has a great opportunity to study with Jeanette Clausen, who directs most of the Shakespeare pieces, as well as all of the pieces that are for their more experimental theater company, Théâtre du Complicité, and just take us through voice exercises just for 5 minutes, and then have me sort of debrief them on what they've seen. So again, a great connection to the authors of the book that we're looking at in class. And probably kind of running out of time, so I'll just say a couple more things about what sort of has worked and what hasn't. Are we losing
Just
something?
like I just left.
Oh, I just left.
I think did it come apart on the other end? The connection?
yeah.
Oh, it didn't.
Okay, gotcha. And we're gonna have time for questions afterwards. One of the other aspects that's been really helpful in terms of reading plays is to use the Miracle Worker, which we're going into rehearsal for tonight. It's actually available free, but then there are a variety of different versions. I can make notes on who I've cast in. Oh, sorry. Still going. Oh well. Trust me, I can take the text of the play and make my own notes about who's been cast or who might be cast as I'm going into auditions. I can make notes on properties, notes for my set designer, but it's still not at a point where an actor could easily take this and they could highlight their lines, could easily do that, but you can't do your blocking. I'm sure that in a couple of years there will be just a few, tricks with your fingers that you can say whether you're going downstage, upstage, so on and so forth. So lots of plays are available in that way. And then also our season selection process. We used to, for every venue, have 3 plays, and then all the music that would need to be downloaded for that on a CD, and have them in one office where 12 people are trying to come in and check them out and listen and read. Now they're all on Sakai, and most of the people on the committee are reading all these plays and listening to the musical examples just on their reader. So it's had a pretty transformational effect on our department and the way we teach our classes.
I have no fear that my presentation technology is not going to work. But I might as well give you something to look at while I'm talking, in case you don't want to look at me. I guess I would say that I am a lover. I'm a lover of books, and I'm a lover of technology, and so this is a natural thing for me to talk about. I decided not to talk specifically about the student responses to the pilot project because there was nothing surprising in it to me, and I thought maybe it wouldn't be surprising to you, and I thought it would probably be more what we would hear from others, so I thought I would take a slightly different approach. The title of the session, Transforming or Alarming. When I think about why would it be alarming, why is an e-textbook potentially alarming? And as I said, I'm a lover of books, so I can imagine that, and I actually thought I'd start with reading. I was going to do it on my iPad, but I decided to do it in the paper book instead. And I'll tell you, the first time I read this passage, I read it with the same mixture of fascination and abhorrence that you might watch a train wreck or something like that. But this is a book by Vernor Vinge, who's a sort of a futurist who writes about technology and impact on society. And he's writing about a time in the near future when books are an endangered species. And this character here, Robert, is going looking for books. On the other side, the power saw racket was louder. He walked 50 feet past plastic crates. Rescue data, the labels said. At the end, behind some kind of forklift, there was another unlocked door. And now he was on familiar ground. He was at the bottom of the library's central staircase. He looked up and up into the foreshortened spiral of steps. Tiny flecks of white floated and swirled in the column of light. Snowflakes? But one landed on his hand, a fleck of paper. And now the ripping buzz of the saw was louder, and there was also the sound of a giant vacuum cleaner. But it was the irregular ripping buzz that echoed down the stairwell and beat him in the head. There was something familiar about it, but it wasn't an indoors kind of sound. He started up the stairs, pausing at each landing. The dust and noise were worst at the 4th floor, labeled Catalog Section PZ. The door opened smoothly, and beyond would be the library stacks. All the books that you could ever want, miles and miles of them. The beauty of ideas waiting in ambush. But this was like no stacks he had ever seen. The floor was draped in white tarpaulin. The air was hazy with drifting debris. He took a breath, smelled pine pitch and burnt wood, and for a moment, he couldn't stop coughing. Brrrap! Painfully loud now, coming from 4 aisles to the right. The shelves were empty here, a littering of paper scraps and dust. Brrrap! Against logic, sometimes recognition comes hard. But finally, Robert remembered the exact sound which that abrupt roar must be. He had heard it occasionally throughout his life, but always the machine had been outdoors. Brrrap! A tree shredder. Ahead of him, everything was empty bookcases, skeletons. Robert went to the end of the aisle and walked toward the noise. The air was a fog of floating paper dust. In the 4th aisle, the space between the bookcases was filled with a pulsing fabric tube. The monster worm was brightly lit from within, and at the other end, 20 feet away, was the worm's maw, the source of the noise. Indistinct in the swirling haze, Robert could see 2 white-suited figures, their jackets labeled Data Rescue. The 2 wore filter masks and head protectors. They might have been construction workers. But in fact, this business was the ultimate in deconstruction. First one of them, and then the other, would pull books off the racks and toss them into the shredder's maw. The maintenance labels made calm phrases of the horror. The raging maw was a Nabocloud custom debinder. The fabric tunnel that stretched out behind it was a camera tunnel. Robert flinched at the sight, and Epiphany randomly rewarded his gesture with an imagery from within the monster. The shredded fragments of books and magazines flew down the tunnel like leaves in a tornado, twisting and tumbling. The inside of the fabric was stitched with thousands of tiny cameras. The shreds were being photographed from every side, again and again, from every angle and orientation, until finally the leaves dropped into a bin just in front of Robert. Rescue data. So the book goes on to describe how this technology then, with all of these camera images, they use computer software to reconstruct what was in these books, and certainly this is a lot faster than Google's digitization approach, which it's robotic now, but you can imagine book by book, page by page is rather slow at doing something like this. Well, at first reading something like that, it might sound a little bit ludicrous, but then a few years after I first read that, I heard that in Berlin, they were using a technology much like this to reconstruct shredded documents that had been shredded just before the fall of East Berlin and the reunification. 16,250 sacks of shredded documents had been confiscated. They estimated that by hand it would take 600 to 800 years of 30 people working nonstop to put them back together. They hoped to do it in 2 years using new computer technology. So perhaps not a ludicrous vision, but certainly to me a dystopian one, not one that I welcome. So the question then, are e-books really a threat to traditional books? And we have an analog in recent technological history. You think of, within my lifetime, LPs, 8-track tapes, cassettes, DVD or CDs, and now finally MP3s. And I guess moving along the way, you might say, the music's the thing, right? So we don't really care so much about the form. The music's the thing. So might a day come when people would say of books, the content is the thing, and the book itself wouldn't matter? I really hope not, because I love books. I brought along books that I love, and I don't just love the content. This isn't just a book that I liked the content of in graduate school. This is the very book that I had and I cracked the spine on, reading a physical object. And I don't think the analog with music is really all that accurate a picture anyway. Our relationship with music in each of these forms has a very, very short history. 30 years maybe for LPs, 20 years for cassettes, and shorter and shorter. Whereas the history of books as print on page has thousands of years of history. So I don't think it will go away quickly. So then the question, if not a threat, perhaps they're not, are they even really useful? And I went to the Abilene Christian University Connected Summit a few years ago. You mentioned Abilene Christian. And they do have very innovative ideas about e-text. What I remember primarily hearing at the summit was people talking about electronic textbooks and saying, we haven't quite figured this out yet, but, and they would go on and say what they were trying to do. And I really got the feeling through the whole conference that it was a very immature technology, that we hadn't quite found the right thing yet. My own criteria for adopting technology in the classroom is it's got to make it easier or it's got to make it better. And so certainly e-textbooks can make it easier in some contexts. I haven't convincingly seen for myself how they make it better yet. I haven't seen it. But that doesn't mean that I think that we won't see it. I think back to in my introduction class in computer science, we do a little bit of history, and I talk about Doug Engelbart back in 1968 giving what is known as the mother of all demos, where in 1968 he introduced the computer mouse, video teleconferencing, hypertext word processing, hypermedia, and collaborative real-time editing in 1968. And these ideas were developed further at Xerox PARC and kind of existed as, that's a cool idea, that's a neat technology, until Steve Jobs saw it in the early 80s and envisioned a way that the ordinary person could take advantage of this. And it went from, that's a cool technology, to, now I see how I can use this thing. And so maybe that's what we're waiting for with e-textbook. We're waiting for some visionary to see how the ordinary people might use them in a way that they can't use other textbook, that they can't use other resources. I'm not sure that we've seen the potential, but I expect and hope that we do see the potential someday soon.
I have found the use of electronic text incredibly valuable to the kind of work that I do in Cyprus. Just to take you to Cyprus, Cyprus is a long way from here. Eastern Mediterranean, it's this little island with the point up there. And I'm one of the co-directors for an archaeological project called the Petri Archaeological Project. And I tend to take students over to Cyprus every year, every other year. And so they complete an upper division history class called History and Archaeology of Cyprus while taking part in something larger, a larger research initiative, the Petri Project. And we work right in this area right there in Larnaca Bay. We've been working there for about 10 years now. We've done survey and excavation and that kind of thing. I have assigned and do regularly assign physical books for my Cyprus class. Students read physical books ahead of time before we ever go to Cyprus. But mainly I assign the physical books in physical form because that is the only form in which they're currently available. The books that I like. I have considered electronic texts to assign for that class, but they're not the books that I want to assign. So I would have considered them, but the other reason is that I want students to read those books ahead of time so that when they get to Cyprus, they can then focus on the archaeology and focus on the modern culture of Cyprus and aren't sitting in their rooms reading the entire time. Nonetheless, there are huge advantages to having electronic text available. What we've done is we've have an enormous PDF library of a wide range of scholarship related to archaeology and history of Cyprus. This is really useful because you don't have to carry all these physical books with you. The most obvious reason, that portability, having access to these digital files it just simplifies things. I used to carry stacks of books with me. Sometimes I'd carry so many books that I'd have to pay extra for airline fees. And I'm glad not to be doing that anymore. This is this is our site, by the way. And right here, it's this late Roman site up here, Hellenistic site here, Bronze Age right here. And we can walk across the plain, and students can pick up artifacts, and we can go back to our primitive library, which is nothing more than a hotel room with computers, and can look up information related to those artifacts right away. And we can see, is this the kind of artifact that's common to Roman sites on the island? Is this an exception? And this literally is our library during the season. This is just a hotel room, and here you have our research center off-site, once we actually leave the site. Similarly, our library, our museum library is not, our facilities are not very impressive. There's not a lot of space, for one thing, to have physical books around. The spaces that we've been given by the Larnaca District Archaeological Museum is like a scene from Indiana Jones, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, that last scene with the storage rooms, where you have just artifacts lining both sides, and there's really not a lot of room for lots of extra things besides our devices, our computers, our laptops, our iPads. You can see last summer I decided to ditch the laptop altogether and go with the iPad. This is really useful because the kinds of things that we're doing with these artifacts is analyzing them in systematic ways, and we compare our analyses to published examples from other sites. This is the kind of information we use. We identify artifacts of particular type, and we do so by linking them to known examples discovered elsewhere. And so this is ceramic rims right here. And these are the typical kind of artifact found here. Some later Roman rim sherds that come from vessels like this, which are about 40 centimeters in diameter. And when you find just the fragments, you need that extra information to be able to piece it together. And we have that information available. You can see here, physical book. This is just one. We do have a couple of copies there. But the electronic library of books and articles has completely changed the way that we do our work. In Cyprus, just as one example, you have to identify, like African red slip, there are over 150 different types of this type of pottery that was produced in Carthage between the 2nd century AD and the 7th century AD. And when you just have the rim fragment of the vessel, you have to be able to look this up in a book. We can simply do that by using PDF. Now this is cumbersome for reasons you talked about earlier, unless you have bookmarks in place that will take you right to that spot. It can be cumbersome, but nonetheless the information is available, and students take part in that research process. So they're part of that identification of the artifacts. A final thing I should say is that different way of thinking about electronic books, but we produce our own books when we're in Cyprus as part of the archaeological work. These are notebooks, right? We are generating physical notebooks. This summer we're going digital as an experiment, and we're going to be using iPads in the excavation trenches to collect data in a way that should be more efficient and should be more should be easier to do than writing in a physical notebook with all the dust and the distractions. So we're going to try this out. Nonetheless, we will be creating a printed archive of the data that we collect. So disadvantages: scrolling through a 300-page book on a laptop or iPad is much more time-consuming, and it does take a lot of concentration. But the advantage is that it really extends our abilities, and it brings our library with us to Cyprus. And I don't think I'll say the extra bit I was going to say, because I think I probably talked for 5 minutes. So I was just going to talk about my own use of iPads and my own use of electronic text in traditional classrooms, but I can save that for the discussion.
Well, I also went to Cyprus this fall, 4 months on a Fulbright research grant, and studied Apostle Barnabas. It was a fascinating 4 months. I have to tell you that my MacBook was really my research tool. I've connected to this massive database Greek text called TLG. It also links me with lexicons. I mean, it's incredible how much power I have in the MacBook, but that's not what I'm going to talk to you about. I wanted to have something where I could read novels, and I don't much care for reading novels, etc., with a MacBook perched on my lap. And so I went around. I went to Barnes and Nobles. I looked at the Nook. I looked at this one. I looked at that one. And basically, the conclusion I came to was the one that requires the least power, that charges the fastest, that I can read in any light situation, basically, that I want to. If I'm on the beach, I can read this thing. It's electronic ink. I don't know, whatever in the world it is. But I can put however many thousand books on this thing. And I think it's absolutely worthless for research. But for books that I don't need to mark up, just if I'm reading a novel, well, I also took some stuff. I've got Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War on here. A little light reading for bedtime, Now, it doesn't have the Greek text. I mean, I can't do any of that sort of thing, but I can read through, and it's really light. I just sort of, and if it's low light in the room, I can read it fine. If it's bright light on the beach, there it is. So I'm really sold on it. I paid like $129 for it, and instead of hauling books with me to Cyprus, which, as Dave said, is really expensive, I can just stick this thing in a little padded sheath and take it with me, and that's about all I have to say.
one of the things I want to talk about, let me get that evidence. As an 18th century historian, American historian, early American historian, when I was in graduate school, it was difficult, and when I thought about teaching early American history, it was very difficult because there was not a lot of material. Now, there were some printed primary sources, but there was not a lot of printed primary sources that you could work with. You had to go to either an archive or some kind of library to look at some of these things. There was one collection known as the Evans Early American Imprint Collection, which I'll talk about here in a second, which was available. The only problem was it was on this old technology called microcards. Some of you are old enough to remember microcards. They were very awkward to work with. Most places didn't have machines, or at least machines that printed. So you had to, basically physically be in the library the whole time. The university where I did my doctorate had a microfilm reader, but it was always breaking down. And since it was such old technology, you didn't have, it took like weeks to get a repairman there. There was one on all of Long Island who, could do this. Eventually, as I started writing my PhD, my thesis, my dissertation, the Evans collection, I should tell you what the Evans collection is. The Evans collection is a collection of every published book published in America from before, Evans 1 at least, that group, it's before 1776. Evans 2, which was a later collection, also known as Shaw and Shoemaker, covered everything from, I should say that Evans 1 covers 1800, everything prior to 1800. The next collection covers everything between 1800 and roughly 1815. What's fascinating about a little lesson on the history of print culture in America, the Evans 2 collection, which covers from 1800 to 1815, is just as large, if not a little bit larger, I think, than the Evans 1 collection, which covers everything from roughly 1607 to 1800. So again, there's a nice little lesson about the proliferation of print in the early American Republic. Having said that, when I started writing my dissertation, some places had microfiche. That way, it moved a lot quicker. You could whip through, hit the forward button, and get through the reel a lot faster. But what really I think revolutionized research and revolutionized, and when I eventually became a professor, my teaching in early American history was when the Evans collection went online, and that's what you're looking at here. Again, no pun intended, but this revolutionized, that's pretty bad. But my work in this field, both as a teacher and as a scholar. So what you're looking at here is something that we have in our library, Messiah College, thanks to the help of the library staff, especially Beth and Mike. We managed to get this, what was maybe 7 or 8 years ago now or so? Yeah, and what it does is it has the Evans database. These are all books that were published during the 18th century, and before actually, 17th and 18th century, in which you can simply search now. You can do a keyword search, and you can get any document or any word that you want, and it'll give you the documents in which that word is in. So let's just say that we are interested in, I'll do a full text search here. Let's just say I want to know, I'm an Old Testament scholar, and I want to know something about the way colonial Americans thought about the book of Jonah, right, or interpreted the book of Jonah. So let's just try this. We'll do a search of Jonah, and immediately we get 3,999 books mention Jonah. Now, Jonah could be a first name of someone that has nothing to do with the book. But nevertheless, as you see the first example there is the 1651 Bay Psalm book, which was used in the New England colony of Massachusetts Bay. We can click on that. And we get a facsimile of the book. So we can actually read the book online. We can make it larger if we want. And it lists, usually on the left-hand side, it will list all the pages. Now let me scroll down here. It should highlight, if I'm not mistaken, the pages in which the word Jonah appears here. But I could be wrong. Yeah, it usually does, but it's a big book. Yeah, there we go. So the bold is exactly where the pages in which the references to Jonah in the psalm, in this psalm book happen to be. So again, this then allows students and researchers to go into this massive collection of over 25,000 works in one and another 25,000 in the second database, and do very precise searches in a way that we couldn't do before, or it would take forever, to sort of go through all of this stuff. So in some ways, this collection really levels the playing field in a lot of ways in terms of who can do first-rate research, who can teach colonial revolutionary America. We can now do just as well in our teaching and research at a place like Messiah than we can at a place like Yale or Harvard. Now, obviously, we don't have that kind of library in terms of physical books, but this allows us to, I think Messiah, because we have this, quickly becomes one of the, top places to do early American history in South Central Pennsylvania, because we're one of the few institutions that have this. So there are scholars from other places who come to Messiah because they can't get access to it online, only we can, faculty and students. They come to use this database. I think Gettysburg may have it and Dickinson, but I think we're one of the few that has access to this. Now, what does this look like in terms of teaching, in terms of scholarship? I use this in my Colonial America class, my Revolutionary America class, my Early American Republic class. Before this, it was very difficult to assign a long research paper, simply because it was very hard to find primary documents from the period. Now, these students can run wild in this. They can come up with all kinds of ideas, all kinds of possible topics. I had a student once who wrote a paper on, fishing. He was a fisherman, and he wrote what was fishing like, with pamphlets about fishing and fish. And he was able to find all kinds of literature about this. People wrote a lot about this in the 18th century, and it was allowed to put a good paper together. I'm going to pick on Amanda. She's sitting over here. I'm working with Amanda right now on her honors thesis. She's writing about tea in 18th century revolutionary America. And what she is finding is she's able to very quickly find all the references to tea, and she's talking about the ways in which tea becomes politicized, right? True patriots don't drink tea. If you're drinking tea, you're not a patriotic. You're a loyalist. You're supporting the British crown. So Amanda could never have written her senior honors thesis without this. She still could have, but she couldn't have done it in the time we allot, for her to finish it. So she's able to come up with newspaper article, and books, all addressing the issue of tea in a very confined period from roughly 1765 to 1776. And she has more than enough sources to work with, I think, on this. In my own research, this has been a great help. I have been sort of plugging away on the side, kind of on a project about a tea party, like the Boston Tea Party that occurred in the tiny little town of Greenwich in southern New Jersey. I've taken students down there the last couple of years to work in the archives there. And what fascinates me about, if you go to the town of Greenwich, you will hear these elaborate accounts about this tea burning. A ship came into the port there in southern New Jersey. The tea was burned. It was a great act of patriotic resistance and so forth. And it makes it sound as if this has been a part of this history's culture this town's culture since 1774, when the event happened. Well, lo and behold, through early American newspapers, which is a third collection that we have, I was able to punch in things like tea burning, tea party, Greenwich, New Jersey, so forth, and found that, and this is somewhat of an argument from silence, so I need to be a little bit careful, but found that this Greenwich tea burning event is not talked about in any of the local papers from that town until the 1870s, over 100 years after, which then leads to a very interesting opportunity to interpret why. Because if you go there today, they have celebrations for this thing and so forth. It makes it sound as if They've been celebrating this thing every single year from 1774 all the way up to the present. So there's a story there about memory and about the way people remember their past. And what was it about the 1870s that made this tea burning so important? All of a sudden in the 1870s, people are talking about it in newspapers all the time. In the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 1790s, 18 teens, I've done complete searches of every regional newspaper, never mentioned. So again, I won't get into all the interpretive issues related to that, but just to show you the way in which this has helped me immensely to eliminate certain possibilities and to suggest, to make some interpretations as to why this event happened the way it did. Someday I'll publish this stuff, but it's right now it's just sort of inching forward. So again, very, very important tool. I think this is one of, this really levels the playing field for us. Allows us to really be able to do things in class that we weren't able to do before. Thanks.
Just a few issues related to ebooks. One is that typically, or one way that ebooks are purchased by libraries is individually. If you purchase one book, then in a library, one person can check that out for 2 weeks and it's unavailable to anybody else. So in the field of e-reserves or course reserves, that model does not really work well because one student could check it out and then nobody else could use it for 2 weeks. We have, another model is we have a subscription database called eBrary, which has over 70,000 academic books. And the advantage of that is that you can refer students to it and it's unlimited simultaneous users. You can download it for 2 weeks as well, but still other people can access it. One downside to that is, and I'm going to skip the interlibrary loan for now, is that it is what's called a revocable collection, so that if they have issues with publishers changing their minds, or authors, they can remove books without telling you. So it's, which is similar to what actually happens with our journal databases, except for things like JSTOR, because sometimes they'll stop including certain journals and so on, but this is something certainly to be aware of. So back to the interlibrary loan. Will students, we don't know, will students and faculty request interlibrary loan print copies when we have the e-book? Should we order print copies of books for which we have e-books? And so ordering becomes a little more complex. So consulting with faculty about that is something that we need to do. Okay, and that's going to finish up.
I'll wrap things up here. I wanted to include this quote from a student. It was in the October 2010 Swinging Bridge, and I thought of all the research I did, I really found this quote to be rather insightful. So he starts off, the context is the student had somehow acquired a Kindle, just writing about the experience of having a Kindle. So I'll just read the quote here. For novels, reference works, and all kinds of classic literature, e-readers are great. When I read nonfiction, such as philosophy or theology, however, I need to look ahead. I need to be able to quickly flip pages so that I can see the layout of the argument. Then when I begin to read from the beginning, my mind fills in the gaps. My comprehension is improved, and I'm less likely to get lost among the trees while walking through the forest. So I think as we're considering different uses of ebooks, it really becomes individualized as to what is the reason that we want to use this ebook. In some cases, it gives us access to primary documents that we would never be able to afford in print for our collection. But in some cases, it may make more sense to continue to have the print. So it's almost like a print plus environment is how we refer to that. And some of the issues are really usability issues again, some of that cognitive mapping and the knowing where you are in the book. I came across this one video thinking of possible future developments within ebooks that I thought at least starts to address some of the usability issues. So I just wanted to play a few seconds of this, showing what it may do. So I think some of the ebook users are at least starting to think about some of these issues that do have some learning implications. So just really wrapping it up, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions. There certainly is enormous potential, but I think we've seen here from the panelists and the research that it certainly is a mixed bag, and it needs some critical analysis for exactly what you want to use the ebook for, and what format would be most appropriate, print or e-text. So I think we'll go ahead and hoping for any kind of questions or your comments about your experiences with ebooks.